The woman's scream cut through the Harlem night like broken glass. August 11th, 1958. A narrow alley between 142nd and Lenox Avenue, 2:30 in the morning. The kind of hour when decent people were asleep and the streets belonged to predators. She was on the ground, dress torn at the shoulder, blood trickling from her lip. The man standing over her wasn't a stranger, he was her husband, Marcus Webb, postal worker by day, drunk and vicious by night. His fist was raised for another blow when the shadow moved at the alley's mouth. Bumpy Johnson didn't announce himself, didn't shout a warning, just stepped into the dim light from the street lamp, his presence filling the narrow space like smoke. Marcus turned, fists still clenched, breath reeking of cheap whiskey and cheaper rage. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The woman stopped whimpering. Marcus's hands slowly lowered. And Bumpy just stood there, watching, calculating, deciding how this moment would end. What happened in the next 4 minutes would ripple through Harlem for years. Would become a story told in beauty parlors and barbershops. Would cement a code that even the most violent men in the neighborhood learned to respect. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't just stop the beating that night. He made an example that redrew the lines of what was acceptable, even in a world built on brutality. Bumpy had been walking back from the Rhythm Club, a speakeasy on 145th, where the jazz was clean and the whiskey was anything but. He preferred the late hours, when the streets thinned out, when he could move without the constant interruptions, the favors asked, the respect paid. He was 53 years old in 1958, moving slower than he used to, but still sharp, still paying attention. The scream wasn't unusual. Harlem had a soundtrack, and violence was part of the arrangement. But something about the pitch, the desperation, made him pause, made him turn into the alley instead of walking past. That instinct, the one that told him when to move and when to wait, had kept him alive through decades most men didn't survive. Marcus Webb saw Bumpy and immediately tried to justify himself. Started talking fast, words slurring together, explaining how his wife disrespected him, how she'd been running her mouth, how a man had to maintain order in his own home. Bumpy didn't respond, just looked at the woman on the ground. Her name was Clara, 26 years old, worked at the textile factory on 135th, had a daughter, 8 years old, staying with Clara's mother tonight. Clara's left eye was swelling shut, her lip was split, her hands were scraped raw from trying to break her fall. She wasn't looking at Bumpy, she was staring at the ground, shame and terror mixing in equal measure. Marcus was still talking, voice rising now, getting defensive, telling Bumpy this wasn't his business, that what happened between a man and his wife stayed between them, that Harlem had rules about interference. He was right about the rules. The unwritten code said you didn't step into domestic situations. Didn't matter how bad it got. A man's home was his territory. But Marcus had made a critical miscalculation. They weren't in his home. They were in an alley, in Harlem, at 2:30 in the morning, and Bumpy Johnson didn't operate by the same rules as everyone else. Bumpy finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. Told Marcus to help his wife up. Marcus hesitated, confused by the calmness. Then he reached down, grabbed Clara's arm rough, tried to yank her to her feet. Bumpy stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, just closed the distance. Told Marcus to try again, gently this time. Marcus's face flushed with anger and alcohol, started to argue, started to explain again how Bumpy didn't understand, how Clara needed discipline, how... Bumpy's hand moved so fast Marcus didn't see it coming. An open palm strike across the face. Not hard enough to drop him, hard enough to shut him up. Hard enough to clarify that the conversation had shifted. Marcus stumbled back against the brick wall, hand flying to his cheek. The shock was total. Nobody touched him, nobody intervened. He was the man in his household. He made the money, he made the rules. And now Bumpy Johnson, the legend he'd heard stories about his entire life, had just slapped him like a disobedient child. Clara was on her feet now, backing away from both of them, eyes wide, not understanding what was happening, but knowing instinctively it was dangerous. Bumpy told Marcus to apologize. Marcus laughed. Bitter, defiant. Said he wasn't apologizing for disciplining his own wife. Said Bumpy was overstepping. Said this would get back to people, that Bumpy was getting old, getting soft, sticking his nose where it didn't belong. Bumpy listened to all of it without expression. Then he reached into his coat pocket. Marcus flinched, expecting a gun. What Bumpy pulled out was a quarter. He held it up in the dim light, told Marcus he was going to walk to the payphone on the corner, make one call, and when he came back, Marcus was going to make a choice. Bumpy walked out of the alley, left Marcus and Clara standing there in the silence. Clara didn't run, knew better. Running made things worse later. Marcus paced, rubbing his face, muttering to himself, trying to figure out what just happened, trying to calculate his next move. He could leave, just walk away, but that meant abandoning Clara, and more importantly, it meant everyone would know Bumpy had punked him in his own neighborhood. He could stay and fight, but fighting Bumpy Johnson wasn't a fight, it was suicide. So he stood there, trapped by pride and fear, waiting for whatever came next. Bumpy returned 6 minutes later. He wasn't alone. 3 men walked behind him, quiet, solid. Faces Clara recognized from the neighborhood. Men who worked for Bumpy. Men who moved product, collected debts, enforced rules that kept the streets functional. They spread out across the alley entrance, blocking escape, blocking witnesses, creating a private space where things could be handled without interruption. Bumpy looked at Marcus, told him he had 2 options. Option 1, get on his knees, apologize to Clara in front of these men, promise never to raise his hand to her again, and walk away with nothing but his bruised ego. Option 2, refuse, and learn what real discipline felt like. Marcus tried to negotiate, tried to appeal to some sense of masculine solidarity, told Bumpy he understood the point had been made, that he'd take Clara home, that everything was fine now. Bumpy shook his head, said the time for talking was over, said Marcus had 10 seconds to kneel or the choice would be made for him. Marcus looked at the 3 men blocking the alley, looked at Clara, still silent, still terrified, looked at Bumpy, whose expression hadn't changed once. And Marcus understood, finally, that this wasn't a bluff, wasn't posturing, this was a door closing. And on the other side of that door was pain he couldn't imagine. He dropped to his knees. The sound his kneecaps made hitting the concrete echoed in the narrow space. Clara's hand went to her mouth. The 3 men watched without comment. Bumpy told Marcus to look at his wife. Marcus kept his eyes on the ground. Bumpy repeated himself, slower. Marcus raised his head, met Clara's eyes for the first time since the beating started. Bumpy told him to apologize, to mean it, to understand that every man in this alley would remember this moment, and if Clara ever showed up with another bruise, another split lip, another mark, Marcus wouldn't get a second warning. Marcus apologized. His voice cracked halfway through. Not from emotion, from humiliation. From the absolute destruction of his self-image happening in real time. He promised he'd never touch her again. Promised he'd be better. Promised whatever Bumpy wanted him to promise. Bumpy listened. Then he told Marcus to stand up. Marcus struggled to his feet, legs shaking. Bumpy stepped close. Close enough that Marcus could smell the tobacco on his breath. Told him to go home, to sleep it off, to think very carefully about the kind of man he wanted to be. And if he ever raised his hand to Clara again, kneeling in an alley would seem like mercy compared to what came next. Marcus left. Didn't look back. Didn't say another word. Just walked out of the alley like a ghost, shoulders hunched, manhood shattered. The 3 men disappeared back into the Harlem night, their job done, the message delivered. Bumpy turned to Clara, asked if she had somewhere safe to stay tonight. Clara nodded, said her mother's place. Bumpy pulled a folded bill from his pocket, $50, told her to take a cab, get her daughter, stay away for a few days while Marcus figured out who he was. Clara took the money with trembling hands, asked why he helped her, asked what she was supposed to do now. Bumpy didn't have easy answers, told her the choice was hers. She could go back to Marcus, see if fear had changed him, or she could leave, build something different. But whatever she decided, she'd do it without the threat of his fists hanging over her. Clara left the alley that night and didn't return to Marcus for 3 weeks. Stayed with her mother, got advice from women who'd lived through similar situations. Some told her to go back, that men like Marcus were everywhere, that at least he had a job and didn't chase other women. Others told her to run, to file for divorce, to start over while she still could. In the end, Clara made a choice that surprised everyone. She went back, but on different terms. Told Marcus if he ever touched her again, she wouldn't call the police. She'd call Bumpy. And Marcus, who'd spent 3 weeks replaying that alley scene in his head every night, understood the weight of that threat. He never hit Clara again, didn't become a good man overnight, but he became a cautious one. A man who'd learned that some boundaries, once crossed, carried consequences even the law couldn't deliver. The story spread through Harlem like wildfire. Got embellished in the telling. Some versions said Bumpy had broken Marcus's legs. Others claimed he'd held a gun to Marcus's head, made him beg for his life. The truth was somehow more powerful than the myths. Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd built his reputation on calculated violence, on strategic ruthlessness, had stopped a domestic dispute and made a grown man kneel in an alley without firing a shot, without drawing blood, without doing anything the police could arrest him for. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, in reputation leveraged to its maximum effect. But the ripple effects went deeper than gossip. Women in Harlem started testing the new boundary, started mentioning Bumpy's name when their husbands got too rough, when the drinking turned violent, when the arguments escalated past words. It wasn't a guarantee of safety. Bumpy couldn't be everywhere, couldn't save everyone, and he made it clear through channels that he wasn't running a domestic protection service. But the precedent had been set. The code had been altered. In a world where women had almost no recourse, where police ignored black women's complaints, where family and church told them to submit and endure, Bumpy Johnson had created a small pocket of consequence. Not every man got the message. Some tested it, thought the Marcus Webb story was exaggerated, thought Bumpy was too old, too busy, too distracted by bigger problems to care about some woman getting roughed up. Those men learned differently. Bumpy didn't handle every case personally, but his network did. A husband who sent his wife to the hospital with broken ribs found his car vandalized the next day, windows smashed, tires slashed. Another man who kicked his girlfriend down a flight of stairs got jumped outside his job, beaten badly enough to require stitches but not badly enough to kill him. The pattern was clear. Touch a woman in Harlem, and the cost was no longer zero. The Italian mob families downtown heard about it. Made jokes at first, called it Bumpy going soft in his old age. Said he was chasing morality instead of money. But the smarter ones understood what was actually happening. Bumpy was expanding his influence in a way that didn't require territory or product. He was becoming a figure women trusted. And in a neighborhood where women controlled households, raised children, and influenced which businesses thrived or died, that was power of a different kind. Power the Italians, with their old-world patriarchy and their violent misogyny, couldn't replicate. The younger generation in Harlem saw it too. The up-and-coming hustlers who wanted to model themselves after Bumpy. They started treating women differently, not out of morality, out of calculation. Because if Bumpy Johnson, the coldest strategist in Harlem, considered domestic violence bad for business, then maybe it was. Maybe having a reputation as the man who beat women was actually a liability in a world where reputation determined survival. The cultural shift wasn't total, wasn't perfect, but it was real, measurable. Women whispered about it in beauty parlors, told their daughters that Harlem was different now, told each other stories about the night Bumpy Johnson walked into an alley and rewrote the rules. Marcus Webb lived another 19 years, worked his postal route, came home at night, drank, but less. Clara stayed with him until his death in 1977. Raised their daughter, who grew up hearing the story of the night Bumpy Johnson saved her mother's life. Whether Clara's marriage became happy is impossible to say, but it became nonviolent, and in 1958 Harlem, that was its own kind of miracle. Clara never spoke to Bumpy again after that night. Saw him on the street occasionally. Nodded. He nodded back. That was all. The debt didn't need to be spoken. The gratitude didn't need to be performed. It existed in the simple fact that Clara lived the rest of her life without fear of her husband's fists. Bumpy never talked about the incident publicly. When people asked, he deflected. Said he'd done what anyone would do. But that wasn't true, and everyone knew it. Nobody else did what Bumpy did that night. Nobody else had the reputation, the network, the cold strategic mind to turn a random act of violence into a teachable moment that reverberated through an entire community. He didn't do it for glory, didn't do it for recognition. Did it because, in his own complicated way, Bumpy Johnson believed in order, in rules, in a version of justice that existed outside the law, outside the courts, outside the systems that ignored people who looked like him. The alley between 142nd and Lenox became a reference point, a landmark in the invisible map of Harlem history. Older residents would point it out to younger ones, tell the story, embellish it, or strip it down depending on the lesson they wanted to teach. Some versions focused on Bumpy's power, others on Clara's courage for going back. Still others on Marcus's humiliation, the image of a grown man on his knees, stripped of everything he thought made him a man. The truth contained all of it: the power, the courage, the humiliation, the complicated, messy reality of a moment when violence was stopped by the threat of greater violence, when justice was delivered by a criminal, when safety came not from law, but from the cold calculation of a man who understood consequence better than anyone alive. Bumpy Johnson died 10 years later, in 1968. Heart attack. Sudden. Final. But the code he'd altered that night in August 1958 outlived him, became part of the fabric of Harlem, part of the unwritten rules that governed how men and women interacted, how respect was defined, how violence was policed in a community that couldn't rely on police. It wasn't perfect, wasn't a solution to systemic problems, but it was something, a small pocket of order in the chaos, a line drawn by a man who'd spent his life erasing lines, clarifying this one time that some boundaries were non-negotiable. Clara Webb attended Bumpy's funeral, stood in the back, didn't speak to the family, didn't make a scene, just paid her respects to the man who'd given her a chance at a different life, and left before anyone could ask questions. Her daughter asked later why they'd gone. Clara told her about the alley, about the kneeling, about the $50 bill and the choice she'd been given. Her daughter asked if Bumpy was a good man. Clara thought about it for a long time. Then she said no. Said he wasn't a good man, but he'd done a good thing. And sometimes, in a world that offered so few good things, that had to be enough. The story lives on, told and retold, altered by time and perspective. But the core remains. The image of Bumpy Johnson standing in an alley at 2:30 in the morning, deciding that this moment, this woman, this violence mattered enough to intervene. That his reputation, carefully built over decades, was strong enough to make a man kneel without a weapon. That power used precisely could create safety where law and morality had failed. It wasn't heroism, wasn't sainthood. It was something stranger and more complicated. A criminal enforcing a code that the legitimate world refused to uphold. A killer protecting a victim. A man built on violence choosing the exact right moment to stop it. That was Bumpy Johnson. Not the myth, not the sanitized version sold in movies and documentaries. The real thing. Complicated, brutal, strategic, and occasionally, in ways nobody expected, protective of the vulnerable in a world designed to crush them. The night he made Marcus Webb kneel wasn't his biggest operation, wasn't his most profitable move, wasn't the moment historians point to when analyzing his impact. But for Clara Webb, for the women who heard the story and felt a little safer, for the men who learned that consequences could come from unexpected places, it was everything. A single moment when the chaos bent to order, when fear became respect. When a woman walked out of an alley alive, protected not by law or love, but by the cold mathematics of reputation and the precise application of power. And that night, in that narrow space between buildings, Bumpy Johnson proved what everyone in Harlem already knew. That sometimes the difference between justice and brutality wasn't the action. It was who delivered it, why, and whether anyone was left standing to remember.